It's Adam here for PC Monitors, and in this video I'm going to be taking a look at the AOC 24G2U, or as it's referred to in some regions such as North America, simply the 24G2. As usual, this video accompanies a written review, and you can find a link to that in the description of the video, alongside information about how you can support the work that we do. As usual for a video, what you see depends on my camera, depends on my video editing software, the processing done by YouTube, and ultimately on the screen you're actually viewing the video on, so in no way does it represent exactly what the monitor looks like firsthand. This monitor is a 23.8 inch Full HD IPS panel, or an IPS type panel. It uses a Panda panel, or a Panda cell, with a custom backlight solution to give it a nice wide colour gamut, and it supports a 144Hz refresh rate. So on paper there are lots of nice features here, the fact it's an IPS type panel, Full HD, relatively small screen size. That's sort of a new combination on the market really, so it's very interesting to see how this is going to be performing. I'm going to primarily look at gaming, as I usually do, but obviously you can use this for a wide variety of tasks, and being an IPS type panel, it does make it more suitable for colour critical work. The pixel density isn't amazing. Full HD resolution 1920 by 1080, kind of on the lower end of modern monitors really, except it isn't a 27 inch or larger screen of that resolution, so the pixel density isn't as low as some models. So you get fairly large desktop icons, readable text, the clarity and detail levels are alright. I mean, it's to be honest, I think the screen size is quite decent for this resolution really. You don't have an amazing amount of desktop real estate to play with, you can't really do lots of multitasking or anything like that. You can see that if you've got a website, like my website here, filling half of the screen, it really does take up a lot of the screen space, and it doesn't really give you a lot of text to work with to read. So it's not incredible in terms of multitasking potential, desktop real estate, detail levels, that kind of thing, but it's perfectly reasonable. But really the high refresh rate is a key feature of this monitor, and naturally that is easier to drive at the Full HD resolution compared to high resolutions. Something I like to comment on early on in my video reviews is the screen surface. This model uses a medium matte anti-glare finish, and it has a fairly smooth surface texture. So this means that the image, when you're observing lighter shades, it doesn't appear particularly grainy. It actually has a smoother appearance than most medium matte screen surfaces, such as those you'd find on TN alternatives to this monitor. So that's quite a nice thing to see. I'm now going to talk about the external features of the monitor. So it's mainly matte black plastic, but there are some red elements. So you can see some little stripes there and there to the left and right of the AOC logo. The AOC logo itself is just a sort of painted on silver colour. It's not shiny or eye-catching in any way really. And there's also a red element there. And the red actually, it sort of doesn't really come across in videos and images so well, but it's actually quite a dark red, and it has a slight sort of metallic finish, kind of satin look. It's not really distracting at all. It's not something you really notice when you're just using the monitor normally. It's just kind of a subtle hint of colour really, so I wouldn't worry about that if you do prefer your monitors to look more plain, because it's not really a major issue in my opinion. There are the OSD controls towards the right side, and they're explored in a separate video, the OSD video. And there's also a little power button there, just a little pinprick design. It glows white when the monitor is switched on, and amber when the monitor enters a low power state. The shape of the stand base is quite interesting, a little bit unconventional. I don't really know what to call it, maybe a starfish design, although the front legs are a lot longer than the rear legs, and obviously starfish have more than 4 legs, unless it's injured. So I don't really know what you'd call that, but it's an interesting design anyway, an interesting shape. Maybe a star-like design would be appropriate. The level of ergonomic flexibility is good, so you can adjust the height of the monitor. You can also tilt it backwards a bit and forwards a very small amount. You can also swivel it left and right, or right and left as I showed you there. And you can rotate it into portrait as well, which is very difficult to do with one hand, as usual, but I can just about manage. There we are, portrait. No, more like a Picasso. There we are, portrait. Of course, from the front, the main thing is the screen itself, and the screen surface is a medium matte anti-glare, so it offers good glare handling. It also has quite a smooth finish to it, so it doesn't give a overly grainy look to the image. It actually has a very low level of graininess, really. There's no obvious graininess, just a sort of light misty graininess, less than you'd see on competing TN models, for example. So I'm quite happy in that respect, and I do explore that elsewhere in the review, but the glare handling characteristics are good. And it has very slender bezels. You can see the bottom bezel is moderately thick, sort of a normal size really, but the top and side, it has a so-called frameless design. So that's actually a dual stage design, as I prefer to call it. And that has so thin that the camera can't even focus on it. You can see there's this little bit of a panel border. It blends in very nicely with the rest of the screen, and it's flush with the rest of the screen. Then outside that, there is a hard black plastic component. So including both of those components, the bezels remain very slender at the top and sides. There are also some little calibration marks, so towards the top right and top left corner, it looks like there's a little section missing. That's completely normal, and it's used for the machine that puts everything together with the monitors and the panels. I'm now on Shadow of the Tomb Raider, and I'm going to talk about the contrast performance of the monitor. As an IPS type panel, contrast isn't really its main strength, but this monitor actually offers very good contrast as far as IPS type panels go. I actually measured around 1500 to 1 depending on the settings used, 1400 to 1 for the static contrast under my test settings, and that's after I've basically tweaked everything to my liking. So that's really very good to see actually. It's about as high as I've ever seen from the panel type, and that was quite impressive. It doesn't give you the kind of depth to dark shades as you would see on a VA model. So the AOC C24G1, for example, has static contrast which is about twice as high as this, maybe a bit higher than that. And that does make a difference. But really, if you compare this to IPS models with much lower static contrast, or even TN models in general, there's actually something to be said for the depth and atmosphere it gives to dark areas. And there are plenty of dark areas on games like this, Tomb Raider. There's lots of dark passageways, such as the one here. And it gives a pretty decent atmospheric look, actually, as far as the panel type goes. It isn't perfect. You can see in the video some sort of like blooms towards the edges of the screen. From a normal viewing position, you don't actually see that towards the top, but you do see it towards the bottom. That is IPS glow, and I'm afraid it is exaggerated on the camera, as often happens. The camera I use doesn't give me the proper flexibility to change the settings to sort of subdue that so it looks more like it would look to the eye. But if you are sitting in a dark room, as I am now, you can notice this to an extent. It's actually a bit lower, the IPS glow. It's a bit lower than I usually see on IPS type panels of this kind of size, so that was actually quite impressive, I guess. But I'm not trying to make out that this is really not a feature on this monitor, because it certainly is. It definitely does have IPS glow, and that does eat away at some of the detail towards the bottom corners in particular from a normal viewing position. So for a normal viewing position would be a bit more like this, a bit higher up. And again, you can see this kind of haze towards the middle of the screen. That's just picked up on the camera, but I can't actually see that to my eye. So it's just something that's exaggerated on the camera. But do be aware of this. IPS glow, it does affect the atmosphere in darker scenes, particularly if you're sitting in a dimly lit room. If you're sitting in a better lighting conditions, this really is subdued a lot, and it's not really something I consider a major issue. The nice thing about being an IPS type panel when it comes to contrast is the consistency of the gamma handling. So in terms of the detail levels, as I mentioned, they are affected peripherally due to the IPS glow, but aside from that, things are nice and consistent. So you don't get this kind of effect that you'd get on TN models where things look much darker higher up the screen, and that's because the perceived gamma is a lot higher, whereas lower down the screen the perceived gamma is significantly lower and things look kind of washed out, flooded, and you get extra detail that shouldn't be there, causing all sorts of strange issues. This game has a nice sort of little test for that, actually, sort of test if you want to call it that, but it has porous rock textures, and that lets you know you can actually climb onto rock surfaces using your equipment. So that's a useful cue in this game. On TN models, that becomes completely invisible towards the top due to the gamma handling, as I mentioned before, or at least it becomes very well masked, more masked than it should, and isn't as visible as it should be. Lower down the screen, that kind of detail becomes really far too obvious, and it kind of looks a bit ugly, to be honest, on TN models. On VA models, there are some shifts as well, particularly lower down the screen and towards the sides. And some models are worse than others. The C24G1 was actually quite good in that respect, didn't have particularly pronounced gamma shifts, but even then there are some shifts in terms of detail levels, whereas on IPS type panels like this, that isn't an issue. I'd already mentioned the screen surface as well. So it's a medium matte anti-glare finish with a fairly smooth surface texture, and that keeps the image and brighter shades looking reasonably smooth and free from obvious graininess. I'm now going to move on to talking about the colour reproduction of the monitor, and as usual I like to start with the Lagom, that's lagom.nl, the website, and the tests for viewing angles. This is a really good way of separating out the different panel types in terms of the colour consistency, because that's really a key differentiator between the three different panel types, the three main groups of LCD panel. As an IPS type panel, it's good consistency, so with the Lagom text, it looks largely a blended grey throughout. I know the camera does this weird little effect where you can see this kind of strange grey striping, these kind of flashes of grey, I should say, that come and go, but you don't actually see that to the eye. That's just the camera being a bit weird with its focus. So it looks largely a blended grey. With the background, you will notice it appears cooler towards the right side, and that isn't something which all units of the AOC will actually have. This is a uniformity issue on my sample. It is exaggerated a bit in the video actually, but it is cooler, and uniformity is something which is explored in more detail in the written review. So refer to that, and as I mentioned, it varies between individual units, so this isn't something that all models will have. Aside from that, the text itself, largely blended grey. There's a little bit of red to the striping, a bit further out, just a little bit, but there are no obvious flashes between saturated red, orange and green, as you would get with a TN panel in particular, and also VA panels. There's no kind of cone in the middle where it's more blended and there are more saturated colours outside. That's typically what you get with a VA panel, for example. Solid colours then, they're nice and consistent as well, or relatively consistent. So the purple block here appears a decent saturated purple, slightly bluish purple. It is a little bit pinker towards the very edges of the screen. I think that's really to do with the very slender panel borders which are used here. That kind of thing is something I've observed on monitors with very thin bezels before, just at the very edges, and actually some without such thin bezels can show this kind of thing as well, depending on how the backlight is arranged. So there is that, but that's really a very small section of the screen that has this. Aside from that, a good consistent purple. Perhaps there's a little bit more pink towards the bottom and towards the bottom corners, just a little bit as well. But really, what you see here is way more consistent than you'd see on other non-IPS type LCDs. The red block, a good, strong, saturated red throughout, a little bit darker towards the very left side of the screen, and again this could be something to do with the bezel, but it's sort of a bit more pronounced on the left than elsewhere. Could also be slightly a uniformity issue. If I move backwards it kind of disappears a little bit, so that to me suggests it's more to do with the viewing angle than uniformity. However, this is just me nitpicking. Really, this is very solid, and if you compare it to a non-IPS type panel, this would look completely different. TN, for example, it would look completely sort of a faded red, pinkish towards the bottom, and really super saturated, very dark towards the top, more or less correct in the middle. This is way more consistent than that. The green block, a good saturated green chartreuse colour, that's the name of the shade, and it's displayed in a nice saturated way. The colour gamut being quite generous makes it look quite green rather than sort of a yellowish green, more a green chartreuse than a yellow chartreuse, if you like your colours and you know what I'm talking about here. So that's good to see, good consistency, no real issues to note. Again, a little bit lighter towards the very edges of the screen, but again, this is just me nitpicking really. It's not really an obvious thing. The blue block, a good consistent deep royal blue throughout, and really nothing to complain about there. I'm now on Battlefield 5 and I'm going to talk about the colour reproduction using some in-game examples. I haven't muted my audio, so sorry about the slight background noise. A little bit of ambience there for you. The colours are vibrant overall. That's really the first word I think people would use to describe them. One of the reasons for this is the generous colour gamut, so it extends comfortably beyond sRGB. Content like this, games, they're designed with the sRGB colour space in mind, so when you're displaying them on a monitor with a wider colour gamut, as this has, I think it was 93% DCI-P3. Exact measurements are given in the written review at the start of the colour reproduction section, but anyway, it covered a decent amount of the DCI-P3 colour space, and that is significantly wider than sRGB. So with monitors like this, when you're displaying sRGB content or sRGB designed content, it appears more saturated than it should, but that's a universal uplift of saturation, so it isn't skewed as you'd get on monitors with, for example, an Adobe RGB gamut, where they're very wide in some regions of the gamut but not in others. So you don't get that kind of skew. Also, you don't get that kind of cartoonish look that you get if you digitally enhance saturation. So there's a game color feature on this monitor, which is a digital saturation enhancement. You could use NVIDIA Digital Vibrance, for example, has a similar effect. And what this does is it pulls shades towards the edge of the colour gamut without expanding the colour gamut itself. And that crushes your shade variety and it makes things look really odd and cartoonish, not natural at all. This monitor, things really just look like a more saturated version of the intended shade, so you do maintain the shade variety. This is a kind of look which actually people have grown accustomed to. Even smartphones these days have very generous colour gamuts, TVs as well. So people are used to looking at devices with much wider than sRGB colour space, even when they're observing sRGB content. So it gives a really nice edge to the vibrancy. The flames here, for example, they have a nice variety of oranges, yellows and reds, so things don't just get sort of crushed together, but there is extra saturation, so the oranges appear more reddish than they should, the yellows appear a little bit orangish in places, that kind of thing. But you do get the variety and a really nice vibrant look overall. The autumnal colours, really good reds there and browns, but a bit too reddish in the hues in places. The rifles as well, they look a little bit too reddish or orangish, the hue of the wood there. It should be more of a neutral brown than it is. The variety is very nice, and the IPS type panel, as I'd shown with Lagom earlier, really good colour consistency, and that means that these saturation levels are maintained throughout the screen. So this again is different to non-IPS type panels. With TN in particular, you'd see obvious changes comparing the top to the bottom of the screen. Things would look very rich and too deep actually towards the top, even if things look appropriate centrally because you've calibrated things correctly. And they would look kind of faded lower down, washed out lower down. VA models, they have these kind of shifts to a lesser degree. You get some loss of saturation towards the edges and towards the bottom of the screen. And if you move your head or you're sitting close to the screen, these kind of shifts exaggerate. With this model, you don't have to worry about that kind of thing. And obviously in games, that's a nice thing, but for colour consistency, for colour critical work, it's a nice thing to have this strong level of colour consistency. But you have to be aware of this extended gamut, especially if you're doing colour critical work. You would have to really profile things with a colorimeter and be using colour aware applications to get the most in terms of colour accuracy from this monitor. There is an sRGB emulation setting. I'll just quickly activate that. So you go to colour temp and then you set it to sRGB. You probably notice straight away it's a lot brighter than what I was using before. That's because the brightness is locked at 90, which is moderately high, but it does subdue things. It does keep things so they're close to the sRGB colour gamut, so things look less vibrant, but they look sort of more appropriate as they should for sRGB content like this, but the high brightness might bother people. I'm on Battlefield 5 again, and I'm going to be talking about the responsiveness of the monitor. This monitor offers a 144Hz refresh rate. That means it's outputting up to 2.4 times as much visual information every second as a 60Hz monitor, or indeed this monitor running at 60Hz or 60 frames a second. You can see in the top right the frame rate counter, frame rate display, and I've got the game running pretty solidly at 144 frames a second, so I'm really making the most out of the monitor in terms of the responsiveness. A few things this refresh rate does for you. One thing is it greatly enhances what I call the connected feel, and that describes how it feels when you interact with the game world, when you're interacting with your character. There's a certain fluidity and a precision which is lacking at lower refresh rates, and indeed lower frame rates. And it's something which you would lack even on a 60Hz monitor if you've got very low input lag. It's separate to this. Low input lag is also important for connected feel. It is an important element of a good connected feel on a monitor, and this monitor has good low input lag. I measured under 4 milliseconds, so that's not a problem on this monitor either. The other thing that the high refresh rate, high frame rate combination does for you is it greatly decreases the perceived blur that you see. This is something which is contributed to by both your eye movement and the pixel responses of the monitor. There's an article on the website all about monitor responsiveness which explores this in some detail. And there's a bit of a summary in the written review, sort of summarising the key facts. But essentially, your eye movement is what creates most of the perceived blur you see on a monitor, and when you increase the refresh rate and have a suitably high frame rate as well, you decrease the perceived blur due to eye movement, so that component is greatly reduced. This gives a nice competitive edge in games. The other aspect of perceived blur, pixel responsiveness, I'm going to say straight off the bat, this monitor is actually very impressive for its panel type. It has very well tuned pixel overdrive. I'm actually using the highest setting available, which is called Strong. You can access the pixel overdrive in the OSD, and I'll show you the other options shortly. But this Strong setting, usually if you use the strongest setting on a monitor, you get loads of overshoot, lots of inverse ghosting, so there'd be lots of bright trailing all over the place, or dark trailing that just appears significantly different in shade to the background or the foreground, so it would stand out for that reason. But really here there's very little in the way of overshoot. There's some very slight traces here and there, but it won't even come out in the video because I'm talking about very slight traces. For example, behind the building here, there's just a very small amount of overshoot. To be honest, it's barely visible. Even to the eye, I have to actually be looking out for it, so it doesn't catch the eye at all, even if you're sensitive to overshoot. So that's really good. And the pixel responses themselves, they're very snappy. They are certainly fast enough for a very solid 144Hz performance. There are some very slight weaknesses. For example, for some of the lighter transitions, the bright rocks here on the ground, the edge there, there's a tiny bit of powdery trailing, so there's a very faint little extra bit of perceived blur, but it really is a minor thing, and it's not going to come out in the video because it's something that most people wouldn't really notice by eye even. So it's just a minor thing, and I'm just pointing it out for completeness really. I'm now on a different scene on Battlefield 5. This is one that I like to use when I'm talking about VA models because there are lots of high contrast transitions, lots of bright shades and dark shades intertwined here, and they cause obvious issues on VA models. On this model, there's really nothing like that. So you don't get smeary trailing, you don't get obvious powdery trailing. So even well-tuned VA models like the AOC C24G1, they have some standout issues still where some pixel responses are clearly slower than optimal. And there's also issues with overshoots where the model has effective pixel overdrive to speed up some of the transitions, and instead of the trailing, the obvious smeary trailing, you might get a bit of overshoot for some transitions instead. So it's not ideal. This model doesn't have that kind of thing. As I mentioned, there's a little bit of overshoot, so you can see it behind the tree there. You probably can't really see it on the video because again, it's actually very faint. It's not obvious overshoot at all, but there's absolutely none of the smeary trailing or anything of that kind of nature. There are some transitions which give what I'd call perhaps a heavy powdery trailing or more noticeable powdery trailing, and that's where very bright shades such as the white there is cast against a medium to dark background or certain medium to dark shades in the background. It's quite an isolated example actually. So I can see where it says E to pick up a letter, or the little blob if you go a bit further out there, the white circle there. It has just a little bit more powdery trailing than you'd see elsewhere. But again, this is just an isolated example. It's not extreme in nature either. It's not like a smeary trailing or anything like that. And if you look at these pots here on VA models, there's usually a noticeable powdery trail around these. In this case, there's absolutely nothing of that sort. So it's really just a very isolated example. And the overall perceived blur on this is really very impressive, and it very much feels and looks like a 144Hz monitor. I'll just quickly show you the other pixel overdrive settings. I mean, I've quite clearly established that the strong setting is excellent at these high frame rates. But if you go into the OSD menu and you go to game setting, you can access the overdrive control. So I've got it set to strong there. If you weaken this off just one level to medium, and I'll just get rid of that crosshair, it's a little bit distracting. You now see an increase in powdery trailing. So behind the flag post there and the tree, there's powdery trailing. It does actually get rid of the overshoot. So I said there was just some slight overshoot. That is now not there at all in this example. But the overall perceived blur is increased. So I think that for these high refresh rates and high frame rates, you should really be using the strong setting because it is optimal. I'll just turn it back to the strong setting and I'll talk about adaptive sync, which is another key feature of this monitor when it comes to responsiveness. This monitor supports adaptive sync, and that means if you've got a compatible AMD GPU or system, you can use AMD FreeSync, and if you've got a compatible NVIDIA GPU, you can use NVIDIA's G-Sync compatible mode. They both work very well on this monitor. The only difference is that with G-Sync compatible mode, the floor of operation, so that's the lowest refresh rate the monitor will go to, is 60 Hz, whereas for AMD FreeSync it's 48 Hz. But you don't have to worry too much about the floor of operation because the monitor does support LFC, low frame rate compensation, or an LFC-like technology for both AMD and NVIDIA users, and that means that the refresh rate will stick to a multiple of the frame rate to keep tearing and stuttering at bay. So that's really what adaptive sync is designed to do. It's designed to keep the frame rate and refresh rate matching nicely where possible. I've increased the graphics settings a bit, and you can now see there are frequent dips below 144 frames a second. With adaptive sync active, as I've got now, there's no tearing and stuttering from mismatches because the refresh rate is keeping sync with the frame rate, so that's really good. If you didn't have adaptive sync active or available, you'd either have obvious tearing if you've got VSync disabled, or you'd have obvious stuttering if you had VSync enabled. And for sensitive users like me, the tearing and stuttering you get without variable refresh rate technologies like this, it's really jarring. Even at these relatively high frame rates, it's something which I really notice in an obvious way, and it sort of just gives a disconnect to the experience, and I don't like it at all. So I really very much appreciate having this technology active. I've now turned the graphics settings up further. My frame rate's around 100 frames a second now. What I notice is a decrease in connected feel and an increase in perceived blur. That's because there is a significant difference in my frame rate compared to what it was before. It's dropped around 44 frames a second or thereabouts, and that does give a significant difference in terms of the connected feel and perceived blur, but it's still very good in both respects, certainly compared to a 60 Hz monitor or running this monitor at 60 Hz, or indeed having the content running at 60 frames a second. So there's certainly an edge compared to that. Another thing to note is that often with FreeSync monitors or monitors which have adaptive sync but don't have a dedicated G-Sync board, they don't have something called variable overdrive. That's something which you get with a G-Sync board, and that means that the pixel overdrive is tuned to various different refresh rates on G-Sync models, and that's proper G-Sync models with a G-Sync board, whereas on models like this, it's really just tuned for higher refresh rates and it doesn't retune itself for lower refresh rates. A common problem is that as the frame rate content dips, if you've got adaptive sync active, which will mean the refresh rate of the monitor also dips, the pixel overdrive's really no longer tuned very well for the lower refresh rates. It's really tuned for 144 Hz. So you get these lower refresh rates, lower frame rates, you then get obvious overshoot. And it really does stand out in an obvious way on quite a lot of monitors. Even when you're just at around 100 frames a second, it starts to really stand out more. On this model, it's really not a lot of overshoot, even at 100 frames a second, or even a bit below this. I mentioned there's some behind the tree there. That does become more obvious than it was at 144 Hz. But to be honest, I think most users would actually find this quite fine. Many would not even notice it in the first place. So I would recommend, even when you're around here, you can just keep the strong setting active. If you activate the medium setting, there's that powdery trailing I mentioned before. I'm not going to bother doing this because it's really just doesn't really come across in an obvious way on the video, but there is an increase in powdery trailing. There's a further bump up in my detail levels now, so my frame rate's dropped further. It's now below 80 frames a second, and the overshoot is becoming more noticeable now. You might be able to see it in the video even behind the tree there, the bright halo trailing. So there are some eye-catching examples of overshoot now, or fairly eye-catching, but compared to some adaptive sync monitors, this isn't actually that strong for overshoot. So some users might find it fine and will just stick with the strong setting, even if you're dipping well below 80 frames a second. But at this point, the medium setting kind of starts to perhaps become more attractive. So I'll just turn that on quickly. So I've got the medium setting active now. And to be honest, at these kind of frame rates, it's actually dipping a bit below 70 frames a second as well at times. The medium setting actually does quite well. It gets rid of that overshoot, but there isn't really a great increase in perceived blur due to the extra powdery trailing. And that's because the pixel response requirements at these reduced frame rates and refresh rates aren't the same as they are at higher frame rates and refresh rates. So you can actually get away with slacker pixel responses, and that's what the medium setting offers. So if you are sensitive to overshoot and you're finding your game is frequently at these relatively low frame rates, then by all means just stick with the medium setting. And I wouldn't stress too much if you use the medium setting and you're sometimes having some peaks above this kind of frame rate. Perhaps that's not where you are most of the time, but every now and then in some scenes you get higher frame rates. Don't stress too much because the medium setting still offers a decent performance at higher refresh rates. It's just that I feel that the strong setting gives an edge and it is optimal, but that isn't to say the medium setting is poor. And you're not going to get any of those smeary transitions which you'd see on VA models, for example. Another thing to note, in the OSD, if you go to the extra setting, it says V frequency FreeSync. It doesn't actively display the refresh rate, it just says FreeSync. However, if you go to game setting in the OSD, you can see there's something called frame counter, and if you turn that on, that will dynamically adjust according to the frame rate of the content. If you've got FreeSync active and it's doing its thing, or adaptive sync active and it's doing its thing. So you can see that's fluctuating as my frame rate fluctuates. If you had adaptive sync disabled or it wasn't working properly, that would just give a readout which matched the static refresh rate of the displays. For example, 144 Hz, if that's what you had it set to. So you can see the frame counter does adjust itself very rapidly to changes in frame rate. It can actually be a bit distracting, to be honest, because of how quickly it reacts. Although it's not quite as quick as some, and that's not a bad thing. Some are so quick that it's extremely distracting and is really the only thing you can look at when you're playing a game. So you can see it sometimes reaches around 60 frames a second. That's because I should have mentioned before actually, I've increased the graphics settings further. You probably notice my frame rate count is tiny now. That's because I've had to activate dynamic super resolution, so it's actually rendering at 4K UHD, and I had to do that because with any other graphics settings in the game itself, I wasn't able to get much of a lower frame rate. It's because I'm using an NVIDIA GTX 1080 Ti at the moment as I'm recording this section of the video, and it's pretty powerful for this scene anyway. So as a reminder, the red thing there, that is the monitor's refresh rate counter. That shows the refresh rate that the monitor is running at. And in the top right there, which won't be very clear in the video, I'm not sure if you're able to see, that is the frame rate of the game. And they're now mismatched. You might be able to see if you can actually read the little thing in the top right. It says 61 or thereabouts, whereas this is hovering around 100 to 102 Hertz or thereabouts. It does fluctuate a lot, but essentially that number is double that number, and that's because this LFC-like technology is activating. One thing to note is that when LFC activates or deactivates, there is a momentary stutter. It's not a strong stutter, but it's something that some users might notice. I wouldn't really worry about it too much because it's very brief and it's not very strong. But just be aware of it, because if you're frequently crossing the LFC boundary, as I am just at the moment, this could become a little bit bothersome. But for the most part, you won't really notice this, and I don't think it really detracts from the overall responsiveness of the monitor. I think this monitor gives a very good responsiveness, very well-tuned pixel overdrive, nice low input lag, good stuff. To wrap up then, aesthetically speaking, the monitor has a fairly unfussy look. It doesn't have an overly gamery look, which can kind of annoy some people if it has lots of bright elements or it just screams gaming monitor in an obvious way. This one doesn't scream gaming monitor. It does have some dark red elements, but they're reasonably subtle. Most of the monitor really is just matte black plastic. The stand design is interesting as well. The stand base has an interesting shape to it, a little bit unusual, but I think it looks quite decent. The ergonomic flexibility is very good. It has very slender bezels at the top and side, so I think the overall design is quite nice. The OSD could use some improvement in terms of the intuitiveness of the control system, and the layout itself is just the same as AOC's used for several years now for most of their monitors, and it's a little bit dated looking, but it still does have a lot of functionality in the OSD. And you can use AOC's G menu software. You can see a little icon there, and it's explored in the OSD video as well if you prefer. The contrast of the monitor, that was actually impressive for the panel type. It's the highest I've recorded on an IPS type panel, the static contrast, and it was around 1400 to 1, or exactly 1400 to 1 according to my measurements using my test settings. With some settings on the monitor, it was close to 1500 to 1. And that's really very good for an IPS type panel. IPS glow, as usual, it did ebb away at some of the detail peripherally, especially towards the bottom corners of the screen from a normal viewing position, but this was actually a little bit lower than I often see on IPS type models of this kind of size, so that was nice as well. The screen surface, I didn't really have any issues with that. It's a medium matte anti-glare screen surface, so it offers good glare handling, but it has a fairly smooth finish to it, a smoother surface texture than, for example, competing TN models have, so it doesn't have an overly grainy look to the image. In terms of the colour reproduction, the colour gamut is generous. That's really a key feature of this monitor. It's one that people don't always appreciate when they look at specs and compare it to other models, but it is something which makes a big difference to the image. It lifts up the saturation levels, it makes things look more vibrant, but it maintains good shade variety because it is achieved with an extended gamut rather than being achieved with a digital saturation enhancement, which just pulls things closer to the edge of the gamut. But if you're doing colour critical work, you do have to be aware of this, and you would want to ideally profile the monitor using a colorimeter or a similar device if you're needing to do colour critical work. But the consistency of the IPS type panel is very good, so shades maintain appropriate gamma saturation levels throughout the screen, so it doesn't have the kind of shifts you see on TN models, particularly vertically, where they appear much darker towards the top of the screen, much lighter, sort of washed out a bit really towards the bottom of the screen. There's nothing like that. It doesn't have the shifts that VA models have as well, where there's some shifts further out and towards the bottom of the screen. The responsiveness was also impressive for the panel type, and actually just impressive overall really. The pixel response is very well tuned. You could just use the strong setting most of the time and that would give a really nice performance. Gave a good solid 144 Hz performance certainly. And really the weaknesses were only minor in terms of a little bit of powdery trailing in places, some isolated weaknesses. The overall performance was very good, and I think actually most people would not notice a difference between this and a well-tuned TN model, for example the ViewSonic XG240R, and if you look at the written review there are some further comparisons drawn between those models and also VA models, the AOC C24G1 specifically, in terms of the overall levels of perceived blur. And this one actually is pretty close. It's closer to the TN model than it is to any VA model, and that's a good thing. It also has low input lag, it has adaptive sync which worked well on NVIDIA and AMD GPUs, so it really ticks a lot of boxes. So overall, if you include the price of this monitor, obviously you can't forget that, it is a budget gaming monitor, it offers a heck of a lot of value for money, really solid overall performance. So that's really all there is to the AOC 24G2U, or 24G2 as it's simply known in some regions such as North America. Be sure to check out the full review on PCmonitors.info. There's a link to that in the description of the video, alongside information about how you can support the work that we do.